When 73-year-old Warren Holloway told his 3 grown children that he had spent $185 on 40 acres of flooded wasteland outside their small Kansas town, they thought grief had finally broken him. His daughter Vanessa called it a reckless mistake. His youngest son Logan laughed and asked if Warren planned to start a mosquito ranch. Even Trevor, the quiet middle child, who rarely criticized anyone, wondered whether his father was making decisions he would later regret. Warren didn't argue with any of them. He simply folded the auction paperwork, placed it inside an old leather folder, and changed the subject. The truth was that Warren knew something about that forgotten land that nobody else alive remembered. For 35 years, he had worked in county land records and property surveys. Decades earlier, he had seen maps that revealed what the flooded acreage had once been before a highway project changed everything. Beneath 60 years of standing water and mud lay a secret, a spring, a history, a promise. And Warren intended to uncover all 3. What his family believed was the worst land purchase in county history would soon reveal a forgotten piece of the past, a buried family legacy, and a discovery worth far more than anyone could imagine. 3 weeks earlier, Warren Holloway sat alone in the back row of the county courthouse, waiting for the annual tax delinquency auction to begin. The room smelled of old wood, floor polish, and coffee that had been sitting on a burner too long. Most of the seats were occupied by local farmers, investors, and property speculators. Some carried folders filled with maps and assessments. Others sat with calculators in their laps. Warren carried nothing except a worn notebook. He listened quietly as parcel after parcel was auctioned away. Small residential lots, vacant storefronts, abandoned farm structures. Each property drew at least a few interested bidders. Then the auctioneer reached parcel 17. 40 acres, he announced. Red Willow Valley Tract, classified wetland. Delinquent taxes since 2015. Opening bid, $185. The room fell silent. Nobody raised a hand. Several people exchanged amused looks. One farmer shook his head. Not worth draining, someone muttered. The auctioneer tried again. $185 for 40 acres. Nothing. Warren slowly lifted his bidder card. The auctioneer blinked. I have one bid. He waited for a response. There wasn't one. The gavel came down. Sold. A few people turned around to see who had purchased the useless property. When they recognized Warren, several looked genuinely confused. He signed the paperwork, wrote the check, and left without speaking to anyone. Outside, a cold autumn wind swept across the courthouse square. Warren climbed into his truck and sat quietly behind the steering wheel. For a long moment, he stared at the envelope containing the deed. Then he drove home. The house felt larger than it used to. 18 months had passed since Margaret's death, but the silence remained. Her favorite reading chair still sat beside the living room window. A knitted blanket rested across the arm, exactly where she had left it. In the kitchen, Warren placed the deed on the table. Beside it sat Margaret's journal. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with gardening notes, pressed flowers, and sketches she had made over the years. Near the middle of the journal, he found the page he was looking for. At the top, written in her neat handwriting, were 3 words: Silver Creek Spring. Warren traced the words with his finger. He remembered hearing Margaret talk about the spring for more than 50 years. As a little girl, she had visited it with her grandmother. She described water so clear it reflected the sky like glass. She described wildflowers growing around limestone rocks. She described a place that had disappeared long before she became an adult. Most people believed the stories were exaggerated memories. Warren knew better, because decades ago, hidden among old survey records, he had found proof that the spring had been real. And if the maps were correct, it was still there, waiting beneath the water, waiting for someone to bring it back. The next morning, Warren woke before sunrise. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old floorboards settling in the darkness. For 18 months, mornings had been the hardest part of the day. Margaret had always been the first one awake. She used to sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, making notes in her garden journal while sunlight slowly filled the room. Now the chair sat empty. Warren poured himself coffee and carried the mug down the hallway to a small room Margaret used to call his cave. The office was barely large enough for a desk, a filing cabinet, and a bookshelf. Most people would have considered it cluttered. To Warren, every folder had a purpose. Every map told a story. He knelt beside the old green filing cabinet and pulled open the bottom drawer. Near the back sat a thick manila folder, secured with a faded rubber band. He had not opened it in almost 2 years. Carefully, he carried it to the desk. Inside were photocopies of survey maps he had made decades earlier while working for the county. Most people never paid attention to old records. Warren always had. Land remembered things. Maps remembered them too. He unfolded the first document. The paper was yellow with age. Across the top was a date, 5 years before the highway project. The map showed Red Willow Valley exactly as it had once existed. Contour lines curved gently across the property. A small blue circle sat near the center. Beside it were handwritten notes. Natural limestone spring. Flow rate, 3 gallons per minute. Soil classification, prime agricultural loam. Warren stared at the markings. He remembered copying the map as a young employee in the survey office. Even then, he had been fascinated by it. The second map was dated 1964. Everything had changed. The spring was gone. The contours had been altered. Large portions of the property were shaded blue and marked as standing water. A note in red ink explained why. Drainage diversion completed for State Highway Expansion Project. Warren leaned back in his chair. He remembered the stories older surveyors used to tell. The county had rerouted a drainage channel to save money during construction. Nobody intended to ruin the land, but once the water flow changed, the low ground slowly flooded. Within a few years, fields disappeared beneath cattails and mud. Families moved away. Memories faded. The spring vanished. Most people assumed it had dried up. Warren knew better. Water didn't simply disappear. It found another path. The spring was still underground. The maps proved it. He looked toward Margaret's journal, resting on the desk. A pressed wildflower marked one of the pages. He opened it. The familiar handwriting immediately caught his eye. I wish I could see Silver Creek Spring one more time. The sentence hit him harder than it had the night before. Margaret had written it during the final year of her life, long before the doctors gave them bad news, long before hospital visits replaced gardening, long before promises became all that remained. Warren closed the journal and stood. By mid-morning, he was driving toward Red Willow Valley. Gray clouds drifted overhead. The air carried the sharp smell of approaching winter. He parked along the gravel road and stepped out. The property stretched before him. Water, mud, dead cattails. Nothing about it looked valuable. Nothing except what he knew lay beneath it. Pulling on a pair of rubber boots, Warren carefully stepped into the flooded ground. The water reached his ankles almost immediately. Mud tugged at his feet with every step. Slowly, he worked his way toward the location marked on the old map, the exact location of the spring. After nearly 20 minutes, he stopped. Something felt different. The ground beneath him was firmer. He crouched and pushed his hand through the surface muck. Past roots, past silt, past decades of accumulated debris. His fingers touched soil, rich soil. He scooped up a handful, black, dense, perfect, the kind of earth farmers dreamed about. A smile appeared on Warren's face for the first time in months. The land wasn't dead. It was trapped. and suddenly he knew exactly what needed to be done. That evening, Warren spread maps across the kitchen table beside Margaret's journal. For hours, he sketched drainage routes and measurements. When midnight arrived, his pencil was dull and his back ached. But the plan was complete. The water had buried the land for 60 years. Now it was finally going to be set free. The next morning, Warren Holloway arrived at Red Willow Valley before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. A thin layer of frost coated the dead cattails, turning the flooded landscape silver in the early light. He parked beside the gravel road and opened the tailgate of his truck. Inside were 2 shovels, a pickaxe, several sections of PVC pipe, marking stakes, and a thermos of coffee. Everything he would need to begin, or at least enough to get started. Standing at the edge of the property, Warren unfolded the drainage plan he had drawn the night before. The concept was simple: reconnect the natural flow of water. The execution would be anything but simple. He would have to dig a primary drainage channel nearly 300 yards long, connecting the flooded low ground to an existing county drainage ditch. If the grades were correct, gravity would do the rest. Water always wanted to move. His job was simply to give it permission. At 7 o'clock sharp, Warren drove the first shovel into the mud. The ground fought back immediately. Every load of wet soil seemed twice as heavy as it should have been. Mud clung stubbornly to the blade. Water seeped into his boots. His lower back began complaining before the first hour was finished. By 10 o'clock, he had completed less than 20 feet. Warren leaned on the shovel and looked at the distance still ahead. The task seemed enormous. 20 years ago, he could have finished this section in a day. At 73, every foot required determination. Still, he kept digging. The work gave him something he hadn't felt since Margaret died: purpose. When noon arrived, he sat on an overturned bucket and ate a sandwich while studying the flooded land. The silence stretched around him. No traffic, no machinery, just wind moving through the cattails. For the first time in many months, the silence did not feel empty. It felt productive, as if the land itself was waiting. By late afternoon, he had completed 30 feet of channel. His gloves were soaked. His shoulders burned. His knees felt like rusted hinges, but the trench was there, visible proof that something was changing. When he finally returned home, exhaustion settled into every muscle. That evening, Vanessa called. "How's the swamp?" she asked. Warren smiled slightly. "Still there." "Dad, you're really doing this?" "I am." There was a pause. "You're 73. I noticed. You shouldn't be out there digging ditches by yourself." "I've handled worse," Vanessa sighed. The conversation ended the same way most conversations ended lately, neither of them convincing the other. The next day, Warren returned, then the day after that, and the day after that. Progress came slowly, foot by foot, shovel by shovel. By the third morning, clouds hung low over the valley. Warren stood knee-deep in mud, clearing another section of trench, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. A young man stood near the road, tall, lean, mid-20s. His brown jacket looked worn but clean. The young man shoved his hands into his pockets against the cold. "You need help?" he asked. Warren studied him carefully, the way he had studied maps for decades. The young man looked tired, not lazy, not careless, just tired. "Looking for work?" Warren asked. The young man nodded. "Looking for anything. What happened to your last job?" The grain elevator closed. Warren had heard about it. Half the workforce had been let go. Many left town afterward. Some never found steady work again. "What's your name?" Warren asked. "Caleb Mercer." "You know how to use a shovel?" Caleb laughed softly. "I grew up on a farm." That was answer enough. Warren pointed toward the truck. "There's an extra shovel in the bed." Caleb hesitated. "You're hiring me?" $15 an hour. The young man's eyes widened slightly. When do I start? Warren pushed the shovel deeper into the mud. Right now. Within minutes, Caleb climbed into the trench beside him. The difference was immediate. The young man worked hard. No complaints. No wasted motion. No constant checking of his phone. Just steady effort. For the first time since starting the project, Warren wasn't working alone. As the afternoon passed, they cleared more ground than Warren had managed during the previous 2 days combined. The trench stretched farther east. Water began collecting along the bottom, moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but moving. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Caleb leaned on his shovel and looked down the length of the channel. I think it's working, he said. Warren followed his gaze. Tiny streams of water were creeping through the trench, seeking lower ground, following the path he had designed. A smile touched Warren's face. It wasn't much. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but after 60 years of standing still, the land had taken its first step toward waking up. And neither of them realized yet that the greatest discovery still lay hidden beneath the water. The first real change appeared 4 days later. Warren noticed it before Caleb did. When he stepped out of his truck that morning, something looked different along the southern edge of the property. At first, he couldn't identify it. Then he realized what it was. The water line had dropped. Not much, perhaps an inch, but it was enough. Enough to prove the drainage channel was working. Enough to prove the maps had been right. Warren stood quietly for a moment, studying the exposed mud along the bank. 60 years of standing water had begun to move. When Caleb arrived, Warren pointed toward the area. See that? The young man followed his gaze. The water's lower, about an inch. Caleb grinned. After 60 years, that's probably a record, Warren chuckled. It'll get faster. They spent the rest of the day extending the main drainage channel farther east. The work was still exhausting. The mud remained heavy. The weather grew colder each morning. Yet something had changed between them. The project no longer felt impossible. Now it felt inevitable. Over the following week, more sections of land emerged. Areas that had been submerged for decades slowly appeared above the water. The exposed ground looked dark and rich. The soil underneath was exactly what Warren remembered from the survey maps. Prime agricultural loam, protected beneath water for generations. One afternoon, while they worked near a drying section, Caleb crouched and scooped up a handful of earth. He rubbed it between his fingers. This is incredible soil, Warren nodded. Some of the best in the county. You knew that before you bought it? I did. Caleb shook his head. Then why didn't anybody else know? Warren drove his shovel into the ground and paused. Because everyone forgot. The answer seemed simple, yet it carried the weight of decades. People forgot places. They forgot stories. They forgot what existed before roads and developments and changing priorities. The land remembered, but people didn't. As the days passed, Warren began teaching Caleb things he had learned during 35 years of survey work. How to recognize natural drainage patterns. How to read subtle changes in elevation. How to understand where water wanted to travel. Caleb absorbed everything. He listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and remembered what he was taught. One cold afternoon, they stood on a slightly elevated section overlooking the property. Warren pointed toward the center of the flooded area. You see that? See what? The way those cattails grow in a circle. Caleb studied them. After a moment, his eyes widened. The ground underneath is different. Warren smiled. Exactly. That's where the spring is, isn't it? The older man looked at him with surprise. You're learning, Caleb grinned. You've got a good teacher. For a while, they worked in silence. Then Caleb asked the question he had avoided for weeks. Why are you really doing this? Warren stopped digging. The wind moved gently through the dead reeds around them. For several seconds, he didn't answer. Then he leaned on the shovel. My wife. Caleb waited. Margaret grew up near here. She used to come to a spring that existed on this land before it flooded. The spring you're looking for? Warren nodded. She talked about it her entire life. The young man listened quietly. Before she died, Warren continued, she told me she wished she could see it one more time. The words lingered between them. Caleb looked across the property, at the water, at the channels, at the slowly emerging land. Suddenly, the project seemed bigger than drainage, bigger than restoration. This wasn't about property. It was about a promise. I understand, Caleb said softly. Warren nodded once and returned to work. By the third week, the transformation became impossible to ignore. Large sections of standing water had disappeared. Black soil stretched across areas that had been underwater for decades. The county drainage ditch now carried a steady stream flowing from the property. Even local residents began noticing. Drivers slowed along the road. Farmers stopped to look. Questions spread. What was Warren Holloway doing out there? Why was the swamp disappearing? One afternoon, just before sunset, Warren decided to walk alone toward the center of the property, the area marked on the old survey maps, the place where Silver Creek Spring was supposed to be. The ground felt firmer than before. The air was still. The fading sunlight painted the drying earth gold. Then he heard it. At first he thought it was wind, but the sound continued. Soft, steady, rhythmic water. Not standing water, moving water, somewhere beneath the ground, hidden below layers of mud and roots and forgotten years. Something was flowing. Warren stood perfectly still. His heart began beating faster. The spring was closer than ever. And for the first time, he believed they might actually find it. The sound haunted Warren for the rest of the evening. Even after he returned home, heated a bowl of soup, and sat alone at the kitchen table, he could still hear it. Water. Moving beneath the earth. Not trapped. Not stagnant. Flowing. For 60 years, Silver Creek Spring had been hidden beneath mud and floodwater. Now, for the first time, Warren believed it was trying to return. The next morning, he arrived at Red Willow Valley before dawn. Caleb's truck was already parked beside the road. The young man stepped out carrying a thermos. You couldn't sleep either? Caleb asked. Warren smiled. Not much. Together they walked toward the center of the property. The area had changed dramatically over the past few weeks. Much of the standing water had disappeared. The ground remained soft, but large patches of dark soil were now visible. The circle of cattails Warren had identified earlier stood directly ahead. Both men stopped. For a moment, neither spoke. Then they heard it again, a faint bubbling sound, steady, persistent, coming from somewhere beneath the ground. Caleb's eyes widened. That's it. Warren nodded. That's it. They spent the entire morning clearing brush and removing layers of accumulated debris. The work required patience. Roots tangled through the soil. Decades of dead vegetation had formed a thick blanket over the area. Slowly, inch by inch, they worked their way downward. Near noon, Caleb struck something hard with his shovel. Stone, not a rock. Something larger. Warren knelt immediately. Using their hands and smaller tools, they carefully brushed away mud. A pale limestone surface emerged. The bubbling sound grew louder. Warren's pulse quickened. He remembered Margaret describing limestone formations around the spring when she was a child. Every detail matched. They cleared another section. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted slightly. A pocket of mud collapsed inward. Clear water burst through a crack in the limestone. For a second, neither man moved. The water continued flowing. Cold. Crystal clear. Alive. Warren stared at it. The spring had returned. After 60 years underground, Silver Creek Spring was flowing once again. A lump formed in his throat. He slowly knelt beside the water. The surface reflected the gray Kansas sky. Tiny ripples spread outward from the bubbling source. Carefully, Warren cupped his hands and lifted some of the water. It was ice cold, exactly as Margaret had always described. He took a drink. The taste was clean and pure. For a brief moment, he could almost hear her voice. He could almost imagine her standing beside him, smiling, laughing, telling him stories about carrying jars of spring water home with her grandmother. Caleb stood quietly nearby. He understood that this moment belonged to Warren. After several minutes, Warren finally spoke. "We found it." Caleb nodded. "You kept your promise." The older man looked at the water again. "Not yet. Seems like you did. We brought the spring back. But there's more buried here." The conviction in his voice surprised even him. Something told Warren the spring wasn't the only thing hidden beneath Red Willow Valley. The maps had revealed one secret. There could be others. The rest of the afternoon was spent clearing around the spring. As more mud disappeared, the limestone shelf expanded. Water flowed steadily through ancient cracks in the rock. The surrounding soil appeared rich and fertile. The entire area felt different now, almost sacred. Near sunset, a pickup truck pulled onto the roadside. An older farmer climbed out. Broad shoulders, weathered face, gray beard. Warren recognized him immediately. Gordon Whitaker, a neighbor and longtime friend. Gordon walked across the property, stopping several times to study the drainage channels. By the time he reached the spring, his expression had changed completely. "What in the world have you done out here?" he asked. "Come look." Warren led him closer. Gordon stared at the water bubbling through the limestone. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he crouched and touched the spring. His eyes widened. "I remember hearing stories about this." It wasn't a story. Apparently not. Gordon picked up a handful of exposed soil nearby. He rubbed it between his fingers. Then he looked up sharply. "Warren, this dirt, I know. This is some of the richest soil I've ever seen." Warren smiled. "That's what 60 years underwater will do." Gordon slowly shook his head. "And you paid $185 for all of this?" Nobody else knew what was underneath. The farmer laughed, not mockingly, with genuine amazement. "Warren Holloway, you may be the smartest fool I've ever met." The three men stood beside the spring as the sun disappeared below the horizon. The water continued flowing, steady, patient, as if it had merely been waiting for someone to remember it. Then, just as they prepared to leave, Caleb noticed something unusual several yards north of the spring. Partially exposed beneath the drying mud was a straight line of stone. Not natural stone, worked stone, carefully cut, deliberately placed, a wall. And suddenly, Warren realized the spring had given them only the first piece of the mystery. Something else had been buried here all along. The following morning, Warren could think of little else besides the line of stone Caleb had uncovered. The spring itself had been an extraordinary discovery, but the appearance of worked limestone suggested something even more significant. People had built things near reliable water sources, always had. And if a structure once stood beside Silver Creek Spring, it could explain why Margaret's stories had survived for generations. By sunrise, Warren and Caleb were back at the site. Neither bothered discussing what they hoped to find. The excitement was obvious. The exposed stones sat where they had left them the evening before, half buried beneath layers of drying mud. Warren crouched beside the formation. The limestone blocks had clearly been shaped by hand. Their edges were too straight, their placement too deliberate. "This wasn't random," Caleb said. "No." "What do you think it was?" Warren ran his fingers across the stone surface. "I think we're about to find out." They abandoned the larger shovels. From that point forward, the excavation became careful work. Hand trowels, brushes, patience. Each layer of mud revealed another piece of the puzzle. By mid-morning, they uncovered a corner, two stone walls meeting at a perfect right angle. The structure continued farther than either had expected. Foot by foot, the outline emerged. A foundation, roughly 20 feet long and 15 feet wide, built directly beside the spring. Gordon Whitaker arrived shortly before lunch. When he saw the exposed walls, he let out a low whistle. "Now that's something. You recognize it?" Warren asked. Gordon shook his head. "No, but my grandfather used to talk about old spring houses that existed around the county before refrigeration." Warren looked toward the spring. The idea immediately made sense. A spring house, a building constructed over natural spring water to keep food cool. Milk, butter, fresh vegetables, everything stored in a naturally chilled environment. Before electric refrigeration, such structures were invaluable. Suddenly, Margaret's stories felt closer than ever. The spring had not merely been a childhood memory. It had once been the center of a small community, the place where families gathered, the place where daily life happened. By late afternoon, nearly the entire foundation was visible. The craftsmanship impressed Warren. Whoever built it had known exactly what they were doing. The limestone blocks fit together tightly, despite more than a century underground. Then Caleb uncovered something else. "Hey, Warren." His voice immediately caught everyone's attention. "What is it?" Caleb pointed toward the southeastern corner. "There's a larger stone here." Warren carefully moved beside him. The block was different from the others. Bigger, heavier, positioned deeper within the foundation. A cornerstone. The moment he saw it, he felt a strange sensation, as if the past was reaching through time. Together they brushed away the remaining dirt. Slowly, carved markings appeared. A date, and beneath it, two initials, E.A. The three men stared silently. "E.A.?" Gordon said. "Does that mean anything to you?" Warren didn't answer immediately. His heart had begun beating faster. Margaret's maiden name had been Ashcroft, and for years she had told stories about a strong-willed ancestor who settled the area long before the town existed. An ancestor named Evelyn Ashcroft. The connection seemed impossible. Yet there it was, carved into stone, visible after more than a century. "I need to check something," Warren said quietly. That afternoon, he drove directly to the county library. The historical archives occupied a small basement room lined with shelves. Most people never visited. Warren had spent countless hours there during his career. He began searching property records, land transfers, tax documents, settlement maps. Hours passed. Finally, he found it. A faded ledger from the 1880s. His finger stopped on a familiar name, Evelyn Ashcroft. The entry showed that she had purchased the 40-acre tract in 1886. The following year, construction records noted improvements to the property. One of them listed a spring house. Warren sat back slowly. For several moments, he simply stared at the page. Margaret had never known. Neither had he. The spring she loved. The stories passed down through generations. The land itself, all of it had belonged to her family. He imagined how Margaret would have reacted. The smile, the tears, the excitement. She would have spent hours researching every detail. Instead, she had died without knowing the full truth. Warren closed the ledger carefully. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the town. As he drove back toward Red Willow Valley, emotions swirled inside him. The project had started as an attempt to restore a forgotten spring. Now it had become something else entirely. A journey into Margaret's family history. A connection across generations. When he arrived, Caleb was still working near the foundation. "Find anything?" the young man asked. Warren nodded. "Evelyn Ashcroft built this place." Caleb froze. "Margaret's family?" "Yes." The two men looked toward the spring. Water flowed steadily through the limestone. Then Warren noticed something unusual near the cornerstone, a narrow opening built into the foundation wall, almost like a hidden compartment. Small, deliberate, and just large enough to hold something inside. Whatever Evelyn Ashcroft had built here, the spring house still had more secrets to reveal. For several seconds, neither Warren nor Caleb spoke. They stood beside the spring house foundation, staring at the narrow compartment hidden inside the limestone wall. The opening was small, barely visible beneath layers of dirt and mineral deposits. Yet it had clearly been built intentionally. Someone had placed it there for a reason. The question was simple. What had they left behind? Should we open it? Caleb asked quietly. Warren looked toward the flowing spring. A strange feeling settled over him. Excitement, curiosity, and something else. Almost reverence. Whatever waited inside had remained untouched for more than a century. Carefully, he said. The two men knelt beside the wall. Using soft brushes and small tools, they cleared away the remaining dirt. Gradually, the compartment became visible, several inches deep, protected by stone on all sides. Then Caleb stopped moving. I see something. Warren leaned closer. Inside sat a glass jar, old, clouded with age, but intact. For a moment, neither man breathed. The jar had been deliberately hidden, protected from weather, protected from time, protected from being forgotten. With extraordinary care, Caleb reached inside and lifted it free. The glass was heavier than expected. A metal lid sealed the top. Something yellowed and folded was visible inside. Paper. Warren's pulse quickened. They carried the jar to a flat section of stone beside the spring. Sunlight reflected off the flowing water as Warren carefully unscrewed the lid. The metal resisted at first, then slowly gave way. A faint smell escaped. Old paper, minerals, history. Inside rested a folded letter. The paper was remarkably well preserved. Warren unfolded it carefully. His hands trembled. At the top of the page was a date, September 14th, 1887. Beneath it were several lines written in elegant handwriting. Warren cleared his throat and began reading aloud. To whoever finds this place in the future. The words immediately captured their attention. My name is Evelyn Ashcroft. Together with my family and neighbors, I built this spring house beside Silver Creek Spring so that those who come after us will always know where the water flows. Caleb sat silently. The only sound was the gentle bubbling of the spring. Warren continued. The spring has served our family faithfully since we settled this land. It gives cold water in summer and never freezes in winter. We share it with our neighbors because some gifts should belong to everyone. His voice grew softer as he read. If this letter survives, then perhaps the spring has survived too. If so, I hope you protect it. Land remembers the people who care for it. Water remembers the paths it was meant to follow. Warren paused. The words felt impossibly personal, as if Evelyn Ashcroft had somehow written them directly for him. The letter continued. I do not know who you are or what this place will become. But if you are standing here, then you cared enough to uncover what others forgot. For that, I thank you. When he finished reading, silence returned. Neither man spoke. Neither needed to. The spring flowed beside them, steady, ancient, patient. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. Margaret should have seen this. Warren nodded. His eyes never left the letter. She would have loved every word. For years, Margaret had spoken about the spring. She had preserved stories passed down through generations. Yet even she had never known the full truth. She had never known that her own ancestor built the spring house or left a message waiting to be discovered. Warren carefully folded the letter. As he did, a sudden wave of dizziness swept through him. The world tilted. His knees weakened. He instinctively reached for the stone wall. Warren! Caleb moved immediately. Strong hands steadied him before he could fall. The older man sat heavily on a limestone block. His vision blurred for several seconds, then gradually returned. When's the last time you ate? Caleb asked. Warren frowned. Breakfast. It's almost 4 o'clock. I forgot. Caleb shook his head. You've been doing that a lot. The young man disappeared briefly and returned with water and a sandwich from his truck. Warren accepted both without argument. The dizziness slowly faded, but the moment served as a reminder. The project mattered. The promise mattered. Yet he was still 73 years old. His body had limits. As the afternoon sunlight softened, they packed their tools. Before leaving, Warren placed the letter inside a protective folder. He wasn't about to risk damaging it. That evening, he sat alone at his kitchen table. Margaret's journal rested on one side. Evelyn Ashcroft's letter rested on the other. More than 100 years separated the two women, yet both had written about the same spring, the same land, the same hope that someone would care enough to protect it. Warren looked from one document to the other, then he quietly spoke into the empty room. I found it, Margaret. The house remained silent. Yet for the first time since her death, the silence felt different, almost comforting. Outside, autumn wind moved through the darkness, and deep beneath Red Willow Valley, the spring continued flowing exactly as it had for generations. But by morning, the discovery of Evelyn's letter would begin spreading through town, and once the community learned what had been found beneath the old swamp, nothing would ever be the same again. Warren underestimated how quickly news could travel through a small town. By the end of the week, nearly everyone had heard some version of the story. The details varied depending on who was telling it. Some said a retired surveyor had discovered a lost spring beneath an abandoned swamp. Others claimed he had uncovered buried treasure. A few insisted he had found evidence of an entire forgotten settlement. The truth was simpler and somehow far more remarkable. A spring, a stone house, a letter from 1887, a promise that had survived generations. The county newspaper sent a young reporter named Melissa Grant to investigate. She spent an entire afternoon walking through Red Willow Valley. Warren showed her the spring, the limestone foundation, the restored drainage channels. Most importantly, he showed her Evelyn Ashcroft's letter. Melissa read every word twice. Then she looked at Warren. This is incredible. It's history. It's more than history. A week later, the story appeared on the front page. The headline read, Lost Spring Returns After 60 Years. The article included photographs of the flowing water, the spring house foundation, and Warren standing beside the newly uncovered cornerstone. Everything changed after that. People started showing up. At first, it was only a few curious visitors, neighbors, local farmers, retired teachers, families looking for something interesting to do on a Saturday afternoon. Then the visitors began bringing things. A woman arrived with several trays of strawberry plants. I heard you're rebuilding the land, she said. These need a home. The next day, a retired carpenter delivered stacks of reclaimed lumber. A local nursery donated fruit tree saplings. Someone else brought fencing supplies. Another family donated gardening tools. Warren accepted every contribution, not because he expected help, but because he could see what was happening. The project no longer belonged only to him. The spring was drawing people together, just as Evelyn Ashcroft had hoped. Caleb noticed it too. One afternoon, he stood beside Warren, watching volunteers clear brush around the spring house. This place is turning into something bigger. Warren nodded. It always was. By late November, the foundation area had become a hive of activity. Raised planting beds appeared along the eastern side of the property. A gravel path connected the road to the spring. Volunteers worked weekends despite the cold weather. Everyone seemed eager to contribute. For the first time in decades, Red Willow Valley felt alive. The most surprising visitors arrived on a Saturday morning. Vanessa stepped out of her car, carrying a folder under one arm. She had driven from Wichita. Warren recognized the expression immediately. Concern, determination, the same look she had worn ever since he purchased the property. I came to see what you've been doing, she said. Warren smiled. You finally got curious. Something like that. Together, they walked toward the spring. Vanessa slowed as the property came into view. The former swamp was gone. Not entirely, but enough had changed to leave her speechless. Dark soil stretched across the valley. Volunteers worked among newly built garden beds. The spring flowed through the center of the property like a ribbon of glass. She stopped walking. For several seconds, she simply stared. This is the same land? The very same. Vanessa looked around again. Disbelief slowly gave way to wonder. Warren led her to the Spring House Foundation. There he handed her a protective copy of Evelyn Ashcroft's letter. Vanessa read quietly. The longer she read, the more emotional she became. When she reached the final paragraph, she lowered the pages and looked toward the spring. Mom would have loved this. She would have. Vanessa nodded slowly. Tears appeared in her eyes. For years, she had listened to Margaret tell stories about Silver Creek Spring. Like everyone else, she assumed they were exaggerated memories. Now the proof stood before her. Not only had the spring existed, it had belonged to their family. More astonishing still, Margaret had never known. Vanessa sat on a limestone block and read the letter a second time. When she finished, she looked at Warren. I was wrong. Warren remained quiet. I thought grief was making you do something foolish. He sat beside her. You were worried. I thought I was protecting you. I know. Vanessa looked across the valley, at the volunteers, at the garden beds, at the people working together around the spring. Then she smiled through her tears. No, Dad. She folded the letter carefully. I think you were protecting something all the rest of us forgot. As the afternoon sun settled across Red Willow Valley, more vehicles arrived along the road, more volunteers, more supplies, more people eager to help. And standing beside the spring, Warren realized the restoration was only beginning, because soon Trevor and Logan would come to see the valley for themselves. And when they did, the future of the property would change forever. The first frost arrived in early December. By then, Red Willow Valley looked nothing like the forgotten swamp Warren Holloway had purchased only a few months earlier. The drainage channels worked quietly beneath the surface. The spring flowed steadily through the limestone. The stone foundations stood exposed and protected beneath temporary coverings. And every weekend brought new volunteers. Yet the greatest changes were not happening in the land. They were happening within Warren's family. 2 weeks after Vanessa's visit, a silver sedan pulled onto the gravel shoulder beside the property. Trevor stepped out first. A few seconds later, Logan climbed out from the passenger side. Warren watched them approach. For a moment, he was reminded of when they were boys. Trevor serious and observant. Logan restless and energetic. Some things never changed. Neither spoke immediately. They simply stared at the valley, the restored spring, the pathways, the volunteers, the foundation. Finally, Logan shook his head. Okay, Warren smiled. Okay, what? I admit it. Admit what? This doesn't look like a mosquito farm. The three men laughed. The tension that had existed for months immediately softened. Warren led them through the property. He showed them the drainage system, the spring, the foundation, the framed copy of Evelyn Ashcroft's letter. Neither son said much. They simply listened. When Trevor finished reading the letter, he folded his arms and stared at the spring for a long time. Mom never knew? No. That's hard to believe. Warren nodded. I think she would have spent every day out here if she had. Probably. Logan sat on one of the limestone blocks. This feels like something she'd love. It is. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The sound of flowing water filled the silence. Then Trevor cleared his throat. What happens after you're gone? The question surprised Warren, not because it was inappropriate, because he had been asking himself the same thing. Trevor continued. I've been thinking about it ever since Vanessa called. Warren waited. This place matters now. He gestured toward the valley. The spring, the foundation, everything you've built. Logan nodded. A lot of people care about it. Trevor looked toward the volunteers, working near the raised beds. If something happened to you, what protects all of this? The question lingered. Warren had no answer. Not yet. That afternoon, the conversation continued around the kitchen table at Warren's house. Maps covered one end of the table. Margaret's journal rested near the center. Trevor spread several legal documents beside it. I've done some research. Warren raised an eyebrow. Of course you have. Trevor smiled. He had always been the practical one. There are ways to preserve land permanently. What kind of ways? A community land trust. The room became quiet. Trevor explained how the structure worked. The land would remain protected. Future development could be prevented. The spring and historical site could be preserved indefinitely. Management could pass from one generation to another without risking the property's purpose. When he finished, Warren looked thoughtful. Could it really last? If it's written correctly, yes. Logan leaned back in his chair. Mom would approve. She would. Over the following weeks, Trevor began preparing paperwork. Meanwhile, life at Red Willow Valley continued growing. The volunteers expanded the garden area. Additional raised beds appeared. Local schools began scheduling visits. People donated seeds and fruit trees. Most importantly, Caleb became increasingly involved in every aspect of the project. One cold afternoon, Warren found him studying old survey maps inside the spring house shelter. You've been looking at those for an hour, Caleb smiled. They're fascinating. Their paperwork, their history. Warren laughed. That answer sounded exactly like something he would have said years earlier. The two spent the afternoon discussing property lines, drainage grades, and survey techniques. By sunset, Warren had reached a conclusion. You ever think about doing this professionally? Caleb looked surprised. Surveying? Land management. The young man hesitated. I never went to college. So? Caleb shrugged. I don't know if I'm smart enough. Warren looked directly at him. You're one of the smartest people I've worked with. The words visibly affected him. For a moment, Caleb said nothing. Then he looked back toward the valley, the spring, the foundation, the land he had helped restore. Maybe. A week later, Warren and his children gathered at the property to plant the first orchard. Apple trees, Margaret's favorite. Vanessa dug holes. Logan carried saplings. Trevor measured spacing with meticulous precision. Caleb helped position each tree. As Warren stood watching them work together, emotion tightened his chest. Months earlier, his children believed he had lost his mind. Now they were helping build the future of the valley. One tree at a time. One memory at a time. One promise at a time. And as the final sapling settled into the soil, Trevor approached, carrying a folder. The completed land trust documents rested inside. Everything was ready. All Warren had to do was decide whether Red Willow Valley would belong to the future as much as it belonged to the past. 1 year later, Red Willow Valley was almost unrecognizable. The flooded wasteland that Warren Holloway had purchased for $185 existed only in memory and old photographs, where stagnant water and cattails had once dominated the landscape. Thriving gardens now stretched across the valley. Rows of vegetables filled the raised beds. Berry bushes lined the pathways. The young apple orchard stood proudly along the southern edge of the property, its branches growing stronger with every season. At the center of it all flowed Silver Creek Spring, clear, cold, steady, just as it had for generations. The old spring house had been carefully restored using limestone that matched the original foundation. A wooden shelter protected the structure from weather. Mounted beside the entrance was a bronze plaque. It carried a simple inscription: "This land has been good to us. I hope it will be good to whoever comes after." Evelyn Ashcroft, 1887. Visitors stopped to read those words every day. Many stood there longer than they expected. Something about them seemed to resonate. Perhaps because everyone understood the message. The land trust documents had been finalized months earlier. Trevor handled every detail. The agreement permanently protected Red Willow Valley from development, sale, or subdivision. The spring would remain. The garden would remain. The history would remain long after all of them were gone. When Warren signed the final paperwork, he felt a sense of peace he had not experienced since Margaret's death. The promise no longer depended on him alone. It belonged to the future. Caleb had changed too. The uncertain young man who had walked up looking for work now carried himself differently, confident, focused, purposeful. He had enrolled in a land surveying program at a nearby community college. During the week, he attended classes. On weekends, he returned to Red Willow Valley. Warren often caught him studying maps beneath the spring house shelter. Each time it made him smile. The knowledge would continue, just as the land would. In late August, the valley hosted its first annual harvest gathering. No one expected a large crowd. More than 70 people arrived. Families carried picnic baskets. Children ran along the pathways. Volunteers filled tables with homemade food. Neighbors who had once driven past the property without noticing now spent entire afternoons there. Vanessa brought her children. Logan helped organize parking. Trevor gave tours explaining the history of the spring house. Laughter echoed across the valley. The sound reminded Warren of stories Margaret used to tell, stories about communities gathering around the spring long ago. In many ways, history had come full circle. As evening approached, someone asked Warren to say a few words. He resisted at first. Public speaking had never been his strength, but eventually he stepped forward. The crowd gathered near the spring house. Behind him stood his children. Caleb stood nearby. The restored spring flowed softly through the limestone. Warren looked around at the faces. Friends, neighbors, family, people who had become part of the valley's story. He cleared his throat. A year ago, most people thought I had lost my mind. The crowd laughed. Even Vanessa raised her hand in mock surrender. Guilty. More laughter followed. Warren smiled. I can't blame them. A 73-year-old man buying 40 acres of flooded land for $185 sounds ridiculous. The smiles remained. But I knew something about this place. His voice softened. I knew what was underneath. He looked toward the spring. The land wasn't dead. It was forgotten. Silence settled across the crowd. My wife Margaret spent her entire life talking about this spring. She believed it mattered. She believed someone should bring it back. He paused. Emotion tightened his throat. This place gave me more than I ever expected. It gave me history. It gave me purpose. It gave me friendships. It gave me my family back. Several people wiped their eyes. Warren smiled gently, and it proved something important. The crowd waited. Some things are worth more than money. Applause erupted. Long and sincere. As darkness settled over Red Willow Valley, families gradually departed. The tables were folded. The food packed away. The pathways grew quiet. Eventually, only Warren remained. As he often did, he walked alone towards Silver Creek Spring. The night air was warm. Crickets sang in the distance. The restored spring house stood peacefully beneath the stars. Warren sat on a nearby bench. In his hands rested Margaret's journal, the same journal that had started everything. He opened it carefully. A pressed wildflower still rested between the pages. Fragile. Beautiful, enduring. He touched it gently. Then he looked toward the spring. The water flowed through the limestone exactly as Evelyn Ashcroft had described in her letter more than a century earlier. Exactly as Margaret had remembered as a child. Exactly as future generations would experience it. For a long time, Warren sat quietly listening. The sound of the spring seemed timeless. Older than roads. Older than maps. Older than memory itself. Finally, he smiled. The promise had been kept. Not perfectly, not quickly, but completely. Above him, the stars shone over Red Willow Valley. Below them, the spring continued its endless journey through stone and soil. And in the gentle darkness, surrounded by the land that nobody wanted and everyone had come to love, Warren Holloway knew that some discoveries were worth waiting a lifetime to find. The water flowed on, and so would the story.